Let's talk about Martin Heidegger's final contribution to philosophy, a book published many years after his death called Contributions to Philosophy. It reflects writings that he did privately and circulated to a few friends over a period of many years. And it develops in a kind of fragmentary way. It's really a set of notes as his thinking develops over time, but it's a fascinating snapshot of what Heidegger was thinking behind the scenes as he was publishing a variety of works that correspond to primarily things after what scholars refer to as the turn in his thinking, the turn after being in time. And so when we look at this, we realize that Heidegger was grappling with the question raised by the essay on truth, this question, fundamentally a transcendental question about the necessary conditions of the possibility of something. And in this case, he was thinking very much about the central concept of being in time, namely Dasein, what it is to be in a world, and to be in a world with others, but also the central question of the essay on the essence of truth. That is to say, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of truth, the possibility of correspondence to a fact, or conformity between thought or language and a thing. And in his language, that becomes the question of disclosure or unconcealment. It is, remember, a dynamic process. The world is dynamic. The problem with the correspondence theory of truth, as people have generally understood it, he thinks, is that it gives us a static picture theory of the world. But actually the world is something like a motion picture, and not in the sense of a rapid series of stills. No, it's fully dynamic, fully continuous. And thinking is also very rapid and has the feel of a flow, of continuity. And so there's something, in a sense, that is problematic about trying to capture this in a still picture, in the way that the correspondence theory tries to do. We have to understand not merely being, but becoming. We have to understand not just truth, but disclosure. We have to understand not just things as they are, but things as they become. Things as they go from possibility to actuality, and then from actuality to being past, and maybe back to possibility, maybe to no longer being possible. So throughout that process, we need to think about not only the necessary conditions of what it is to be, for the very possibility of being or becoming, we need to think about the very conditions for the possibility of disclosure, of unconcealment. Yes, it's possible you'll be stung by a wasp as you talk about Heidegger. Well, luckily that was not, at least yet, actualized. So we need to think about what it is for something to be possible, what it is for something to be actual, what it is for something to go from one to the other, that becoming, that disclosing, that unconcealment or actualization. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of that? It's at this point that Heidegger, takes many years to sort out what he thinks about that. And that's what Contributions is all about. Now, its central concept is one that it's very difficult to translate into English. It is ereignis. And some people have translated that as event, and indeed that idea of becoming, of disclosing, of being unconcealed or actualizing, that's an event, right? An event, something happens. And so we could think that the basic issue here is coming up with an ontology of events, of these becomings, disclosings, etc. But others have translated it as something really ugly, enoning, something, making it mine, okay? I think appropriation would be an ordinary English word that might mean the same thing. Appropriating something is something like taking it and making it yours. But there is a deep philosophical issue underlying this. The obscurity of the German here and the ugliness of an English term like enoning shouldn't make us neglect the basic form of the question he's raising, because I think it is actually a very deep question. He says, if the ground of being in the world with others is being, and its disclosure in time, what is the ground of that? What are the necessary conditions of the possibility of being's disclosure? Or, as he now puts it in the contributions, it's unfolding through time. Being is, in some sense, essentially becoming. It is essentially unfolding. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of unfolding through time? So, framing that question leads Heidegger to focus on that unfolding. What is this unfolding in time, and what are the necessary conditions for it? The answer here, event, appropriation, and owning, are hard to understand. But I think he's thinking of actions and acts of interpretation as similar in their general structure and nature. So part of what's going on here is the actualization of something. Being unfolds. The wasp flies by the table. And some things then are, well, disclosed, like our awareness of the wasp flying by the table. So Heidegger thinks of actions in the ordinary sense and acts of interpretation as having the same basic structure. Something happening, becoming actual, like the wasp flying by the table, that has the same structure as our awareness of it becoming actualized. Our awareness, our thought of it, maybe speaking of it, becoming actual. So he says in both cases, there is something like a, well, being making something its own, or me in thought or in language making something my own, appropriating it. Dasein unfolds in a series of those appropriations, enonings, events, if you will, actualizations, becomings. Now, my being in the world, he says, consists in making things my own in this way. And indeed, now we can think about that problem of Geworfenheit, of thrownness, in a different way. Look, what I'm doing all the time is making things my own. And that's just a big thing I have to make my own when I recognize that I was thrown into this world in a place, a time that were not of my own choosing. I have to make them my own. I have to appropriate them. And that process of appropriation or enowning is part of what is essential to Dasein itself. That's essential to Dasein in deeper ways. Really, every day, everything we do involves appropriating something, using it for a purpose, perhaps, thinking of it, bringing it into thought, speaking of it. All of those things are appropriations, are enonings, are examples of unfolding that involves in making something ours. So one way of thinking about it is that being in the world is a kind of sense-making activity. It is a series of recognitions, yes, thoughts, perceptions, feelings, sayings, but it's something more than that. It's acts of interpretation. When I see something fly by, I interpret it as a wasp, and I recognize this could be bad. I don't want to be stung by a wasp. And so what am I doing? I'm interpreting that action. I'm interpreting that event. My whole life is a series of such enonings, appropriations, interpretings. So another way of thinking about eregness, this fundamental concept, is to think that what I am doing throughout this process is interpreting the world. And the world consists of a series of unfoldings, of interpretings. So let's go back to this idea of truth. What is a necessary condition for the possibility of disclosure, of conformity, of thought to thing? Well, here's one thing, at any rate. It's interpretation. It is making something my own interpreting something in the world. I have to interpret it before I can think about it or say anything about it. That act of interpretation is something that is fundamental. So Dasein is essentially a kind of being that becomes through acts of sense-giving. So if Dasein is essentially a kind of being that unfolds through time and does so through sense-making, through interpretation, we have to ask another transcendental question. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of sense-making, of interpretation? That's a deep question. And to answer it, we have to understand what it is to interpret something. What is it to give it a sense, to make sense of it? And I'm doing that all the time. When I see the wasp, when I look at words on a page, when I do anything, I am interpreting the world around me. I'm making sense of it in some way. He says, look, what I'm doing then is plugging this into a network of meanings. Meanings have to be understood in connection to other meanings. I can't do this in isolation. It's not as if meaning or reference are things that take place asystematically, just one-on-one, in a kind of atomistic fashion. No, he says, there's a kind of holism involved here. When I interpret something, I am interpreting it in light of a framework of interpretation I already have. I already have a network of meanings. In language, I already have a network of meanings in language. And I say something, interpreting it linguistically, because I've already got some meanings. I've already got some things that have semantic content. I listen, for example, to that whistle blow. And I think, what on earth is that? I don't live very near train tracks. What is that? And I try to interpret it. What am I doing? I am trying to plug that now into a systematic framework of meanings. It sounds like a train whistle, but I don't live anywhere near train tracks, so how could that be a train whistle? I think, what else could it be? Is it connected to the helicopter going overhead? Maybe. Maybe it's an odd kind of truck horn, but I've never heard a truck horn like that before. What was that? I don't know. And so I don't know how to interpret it because I don't know how to plug it into a network of meanings. That, Heidegger says, is fundamental. I can hear the helicopter and say, aha, I know what that is. I already have in my network of meanings the concept of a helicopter and a word for that. So I can plug that in. But that whistle, all I've got that's similar is train whistle, and it doesn't make any sense. So I don't know what to do. Now, all of that suggests a holistic picture of meaning. I understand things, I interpret them in terms of an already given framework of meanings. And so here, we could think what's going on is that being unfolds in these acts of interpretation, these acts of sense-making. What are necessary conditions for the possibility of those is an already existing network of meanings. But now it looks like we get into this infinite regress problem. Where did that network of meanings come from? It came from the communities around us and their histories, from my own history. But hold on a second. That seems to just kick it back one level. Where did I get it before? Where did my community get it? Well, they developed it over time. They were given it by their communities. Well, how did they get it? Surely there have to be initial acts of interpretation that don't presuppose networks of meaning. Now, at this point, I think Heidegger recognizes this and does not really have, strictly speaking, a fully holistic notion. That is to say, when I hear a sound like the one I heard before and think, what is that? And the best I can do is train whistle, but then realize that doesn't quite make sense in terms of the network of meanings that I already have. I'm thinking not about everything in that network of meanings. I'm thinking about things that are relevant to that. So I'm thinking about train whistles, and then I think, could that be some kind of truck horn or some kind of factory whistle? But there are no factories around here. Or some kind of office building emergency alert, or I find myself searching a certain locale within that larger framework of meanings for something to pin it onto. I don't begin doing other things. I don't pull out the Encyclopedia of Philosophy and start searching for things that could explain the train whistle. Train whistle. The quote-unquote train whistle that doesn't seem like it could have been a train whistle. I start looking for something else. And I look for it within a certain space. I think we do the same thing with color terms. It's not as if I have to understand all color terms to understand one of them, but I may have to understand a certain network. Look at my shirt, for example, and ask about the colors in it. We describe them. We don't have to know the names of every single color to describe it, or even have concepts or phenomenal concepts for every possible color. But we do have a certain framework. And we can say, okay, that's red, that looks blue, that looks gray, that looks purple. And we have, in short, a local framework. So I think what Heidegger ends up arguing for here is not an atomism by any means, but also, for the infinite regress reasons, not quite a holism either. It's more like a localism. He's thinking, here's what's going on. I have to interpret things by locating them in a network of meanings. In that large overall network of meanings that are given to me by my community, my society, my own history, my own idiolect, No. I mean, in a sense, yes, but I don't plug them into the whole network every single time. What I'm doing is plugging them into a local network, a local network of relevant meanings. Think about the way children learn color concepts. They learn basic ones: white, black, red, blue, green, yellow, orange, purple. And then they gradually refine them. And only some people refine them to a high degree. Those who are working in paint stores or artists or in some other way have to know precisely what that shade of blue is. Most of us are content to say blue or indigo or, sky blue or turquoise or something like that. And we don't go into the very fine things. Oh, that's deep sea ocean blue, or that's sea green, etc. And so these are local networks that have a certain, I think we might say, focal resolution to them. Sometimes it's pretty coarse-grained, like primary colors. Sometimes it's very, very fine-grained, as in an artist's studio, or in a fashion house, for example, or in other places like that where fine discriminations of color make sense. Most of us, as adults, have a network of color meanings that's somewhere in between. When I hear a sound like the one we heard before, I don't immediately think, well, what color was that? Maybe some people do, but I don't think about that. That is an irrelevant framework from my point of view. So, in thinking about the necessary conditions for the possibility of interpretation, yes, we must have a framework of meanings. But it doesn't mean that to engage in any act of interpretation, I have to have one framework that enables me to interpret anything. In other words, the claim isn't that there is a framework of interpretation. That is a necessary condition for the possibility of all acts of interpretation. It's rather for any act of interpretation, there is some framework of meanings that is a condition for the possibility of that act of interpretation. But sometimes it's a color framework. Sometimes it's a framework of sounds. Sometimes it's a framework of plants. Sometimes of animals. Sometimes of philosophers. It can be any variety of things, and there are these little local maps. So in a sense, we don't have to say, you locate this location in terms of this map of the universe. Instead, we can say, well, we have local maps. I can tell you where I am by looking at a map of Austin. Show me Texas, I can show you in general where I am, but now it's not very precise. Show me the United States, okay, roughly around there. Show me the world, well, gosh, you can barely see it. From space, I guess that dot over there is Earth. From some other galaxy, can't even see it. And so we don't locate meanings in terms of one whole all the time. We are presupposing individual networks of meaning. Now we can ask, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of such networks of meaning? And indeed, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of meaning at all? What is meaning? What is reference? And what are the necessary conditions for the very possibility of meaning or reference? Now we're at very deep questions in the philosophy of language. And in the contributions, I think this is a place where Heidegger ends up giving up, thinking that in the end he can't do it. He can't give you an explanation of the necessary conditions for the possibility of networks of meaning themselves. He can point to society, to communities, and he can say, well, there are patterns of life in a community. And so one possible path here is to have a social type of answer, a communitarian answer, to say communities have networks of activities, and I interpret meanings in something like the way I interpret people's actions. I interpret actions within a given space of communal interaction. And so we've said that essential to Dasein is Mitdasein, being in a world with others. Well, part of what it is to be in a world with others is to be engaged in these networks, these shared networks of action, of caring, of concern, of meaning. But that doesn't feel like an answer. It feels like it's simply a way of locating the question. And so that is a kind of answer that I think tempts Heidegger, but that he's not fully satisfied with. Because, again, we can ask the transcendental question. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of that kind of sense-giving community? and it's hard to see how to answer it. We can begin to think about the very possibility of thought. What are the necessary conditions for the very possibility of thinking? And again, he isn't sure what to say. So I think by the end of Contributions, we're really led to a position of saying, these questions can't be answered by philosophy. In fact, they can't be answered by language. Maybe they can't be answered at all. But I think the reason that Contributions was never published is that it never came to any resolution. Heidegger asks deeper and deeper transcendental questions, finds himself led into deeper and deeper territory in philosophy, and finds that philosophy and language and thought themselves can't provide solutions, can't provide answers to the questions that he's asked.